In the late afternoon of Saturday, March 25, 1911, the top 3 floors of the Ash Factory building in Manhattan erupted in flames. The busy New York street quickly became a scene of horror. Crowds lined the street as first responders tried desperately to extinguish the flames. Screams of terror filled the air as countless young women began jumping to their death, and in less than 25 minutes, the fire had killed 146 employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory. The horrific fire is often remembered as one of the most infamous incidents in American industrial history. However, the event shined a much-needed light on the dangers of conditions within sweatshop factories and led to the creation of a series of laws and regulations that would better advocate for worker safety. The late 1800s in the United States is known as the Industrial or Gilded Age and was predominantly known for creating revolutionary innovations, such as building railroads and mass production of goods. With a surplus of new products and increasing demand, the rise of industrial factories ensued. During this time, mass manufacturing in large factories became the most common form of labor. Due to such high demand for products, factories had virtually no standards for who they would employ. This included undocumented immigrants and sometimes children as young as 14. The main priority of these factories was quantity over quality, often leaving working conditions less than satisfactory. Just a decade later, the 1900s became known as the Progressive Era, a time period in which social activism and political reform occurred. The Progressive Era set many precedents regarding factory regulations and result of the Triangle Factory fire. The compromises brought light to the conflict of poor and unsafe working conditions that had been occurring in factories for decades. Around 4:30 p.m., a call was made to Ladder Company 20 Fire Department about a large factory explosion in Manhattan. With roughly 600 people still inside at the time of the disaster, workers frantically began to search for escape routes. The overcrowded, poorly engineered building presented many challenges for the panicked workers. With no prior practice for emergencies, the employees were oblivious to resources and procedures in the event of an emergency. Only one of the 4 factory elevators was fully operational for worker use. Additionally, no doors were unlocked from the inside at the time because workers were only allowed to exit through one door each day in order to assure that no products were being stolen. The building had only one fire escape, which would have taken several hours to safely move all workers. However, the escape was extremely outdated and collapsed within 5 minutes of use. With crowded corridors, a broken fire escape, and no sprinkler system, the fire was growing rapidly and employees had no effective escape routes. With no other options, women began to jump out windows, falling to their death 9 stories below, many of their bodies tearing through the firemen's safety nets. Bystanders and first responders watched in horror as countless lives were lost before their eyes. Several hours later, the fire had been extinguished and 146 innocent victims were lost in what became the deadliest industrial disaster in the history of New York City. By 1909, New York City's largest population of skilled female immigrant workers made it a hub for garment manufacturing in the United States. The boycotts of 1909 were led by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, otherwise known as the ILGWU. The ILGWU was formed in 1900 by delegates representing unions from the major garment centers. During this time, the ILGWU was extremely unorganized and faced many challenges in expanding and maintaining both membership and funding. The majority of the union was made up by young immigrant females, specifically Jewish immigrants, who had first-hand experience with low wages, excessively long hours, and unsanitary and dangerous working conditions. On November 23, 1909, more than 20,000 Shirtwaist employees launched an 11-week strike. The strike was created in order to protest several of New York's largest manufacturers of shirtwaists, including the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. After 5 weeks, one company settled and agreed to the terms the strikers had set in place. However, the Leeserson Company and the Triangle Shirtwaist Companies refused. The Triangle and Leeserson Companies even went as far as to hire thugs and prostitutes to abuse the strikers, often with aid from policemen who arrested strikers on charges of assault. Eventually, the strikers had to make a decision: go back to work or face being arrested and living in fear. The strike was momentous for its size, duration, and support from middle-class women, making it the largest female strike in history. After the fire, the community was in shock, eventually turning into anger directed at the factory industries. Several newspaper companies voiced their opinions on the murder of innocent employees, going as far as to accuse the owners Blank and Harris for purposefully setting the fire. Protesters flooded the streets of New York, demanding that factory owners receive punishment for taking their loved ones' lives. The fire itself caused a flood of criticism and disgust towards factories in New York. Prior to the fire, employee safety was taken very lightly, to the extent of which many people believed that the reports filed by women were merely complaints. Of course, it is well known that those who were killed in the Triangle disaster are only part, and a small part, of those murdered in the industry during the passing year. The whole capitalist system is based upon such unspeakable systematic murder, and those who defend the capitalist system defend those murders. Much of the public outrage concerning the fire fell on the factory owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blank. Approximately 2 weeks after the fire, a grand jury indicted Harris and Blank on charges of manslaughter. Under Judge Thomas Crane, the trial of Harris and Blank began on December 4, 1911. On December 27th, Judge Crane read a section of New York's labor law to the jury. This text stating that all doors leading into any factory shall be so constructed to open outwardly and shall not be locked during working hours. After deliberating for just under 2 hours, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty on the charges of manslaughter because they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the owners had knowledge of the locked door and that it explicitly caused deaths. The verdict of the trial did not end the need for change in industrial factories. In fact, it sparked more boycotts on behalf of the public, which caused the government to not only take notice, but take action. Robert Adamson was appointed Fire Commissioner of New York City in 1914. During his time as commissioner, Adamson wrote a journal addressing and commenting on the regulations established after the fire of 1911. In 1914, he reported there had been 107,000 inspections made in a single month, and over 15,000 of those inspections reported violations in factories. 7 months after the fire, New York established the Sullivan-Hoey Law, which created the New York Fire Prevention Bureau, the first of its kind. The NFPA was given the sole responsibility and jurisdiction to fire prevention matters, such as requiring automatic sprinklers in all public areas and work. The fire also established new inspection standards, such as thorough inspection reports documented and higher standards and education minimums to pass as an official inspector. Each complete new inspection report included measurement of stair width, risers, treads, stair halls, aisles, exits, fire escapes, windows, and more. Many of these inspection standards were brought to light as outdated in the trial. The first act concerning labor rights was created almost 30 years after the fire as part of the New Deal. President Roosevelt and Francis Perkins, Secretary of the Department of Labor, established a new deal with the National Labor Relations Act. This act forbids employers from interfering with or restraining employees from their right to be able to organize, form, join, or assist in labor organization. This allowed the creation of the Union Congress of Industrial Organization, which was one of the most important unions of its time. The New Deal precedents are still intact today, in 2018, setting standards for workers to unionize. Although the conflict between industrial employees and factory corporations concerning the lack of safety regulations was significant, the Triangle Factory Fire of 1911 was the primary factor in establishing compromising precedents.